Today we're going to try to do this with the microphone right up next to my mouth and see what kind of impact that has on the sound quality. So the topic today is related to the topic of a previous episode, thinking and simulated thinking. But here I'm focused on a different distinction that I'm going to characterize as paradigmatic mind and liminal mind or liminal consciousness. So to begin with, I want to characterize paradigmatic mind. The concept of a paradigm, as far as I personally know, comes from Kuhn, who was discussing this in the context of social environments, particularly specifically scientific communities, and the frameworks, the collective sense-making frameworks that were used to describe the world, natural phenomena. I'm using it in a different sense. I'm using it in the sense of the sense-making framework that a given individual uses to make sense of their environment. So, for example, if you had a contemporary physicalist paradigm and you saw an apple fall from a tree, you might invoke the notion of gravity to describe what happened. Whereas, say, for example, you maybe had an animist paradigm, you might suspect that maybe the tree was trying to convey something to you. And so the sense-making frameworks, these paradigms, stand in between raw perception of the blooming, buzzing confusion of phenomenal reality and the way we actually, make sense of what's going on, ultimately for the purposes of making meaning of what's going on and taking actions in the world. Now, paradigms operate in my story with three interrelating principles. The first is the principle of responsiveness, which is to say that the paradigm exists, as I said, for the purpose of making sense of your environment so that you can then make meaningful choices and effective choices in your environment. So paradigms emerge so that you can respond to reality. However, paradigms also seem to have two other primary characteristics. One I might call the principle of conservation, which is to say that paradigms in some sense seek to change as little as they can possibly change. So hold as much as possible unchanging and only change at the edges minimally. And then the third is the principle of minimum dissonance, which is to say that if some kind of perception shows up, some experience comes in that doesn't make sense in the paradigm, there's something about the way that your sense-making framework operates where what you are experiencing doesn't make sense. This shows up as dissonance, and paradigms need to resolve dissonance, but they need to resolve dissonance also under the principle of maximum conservation. So, say, for example, for whatever reason, your particular paradigm didn't have any room whatsoever for the notion of a hummingbird, and you're sitting in a park and a hummingbird flies by. Well, the principle of dissonance is that something has just been experienced that doesn't make sense, and so this needs to be resolved. The principle of maximum conservation is that the paradigm will endeavor to find a way to make sense of this with the least amount of change. And here, things like self-deception and delusion actually come in quite often. Now, of course, it might be that your paradigm will change to include the concept of hummingbird. And so you've got the idea of bird, and it's not that hard to extend it to some other kind of bird, and then eventually be able to potentially evolve your paradigm or develop it to be able to include this entirely new concept of hummingbird. But perhaps the easiest thing to do is just to maybe supposedly just imagined it, that it wasn't in fact real. And of course, we know that the human mind is extraordinarily capable of not perceiving, or at least not being aware of the fact of perceiving things in the sensory environment. And this can be happening because it just edits things out that don't seem to be useful, like say a gorilla walking across behind a basketball game. I don't know if you're familiar with that particular experiment. Or it can erase things that are just don't make any sense. All here now within the boundaries of the principle of responsiveness. So let's say, for example, you had a paradigm that for whatever reason had a framework that you were fireproof. You could not be burned. And you found yourself in a fire. And so you're now experiencing dissonance, which is to say that your body, your skin is sending you signals that are at a minimum pain, in fact, being burned, some kind of harm. But your paradigm, under the principle of conservation, seeks not to change. Now, what's going to happen here is tension. You've got a tension between the dissonance and the conservation, but you also have a tension now with responsiveness. That to fail to respond to what's actually happening is a violation of that principle. Now, here things can be very complex. Sometimes the paradigm, for whatever reason, has enough hold on you, on your mind, that it holds, and the principle of dissonance is resolved through a delusion, which is to say, no, this isn't really pain. I don't feel anything, and you go the delusional path, which holds the conservation of the paradigm. But in this case now, because it's fire, you'll eventually run into some critical threshold and say you die. So death is the absolute boundary of the principle of responsiveness. Now, of course, in most circumstances, there's a meaningful gap between where the principle of conservation gives up and where you actually die. And of course, also in other cases, we're quite familiar with circumstances where people choose to die rather than change what they believe. Right? That's not at all uncommon in our environment. But when you find yourself in a circumstance where the principle of responsiveness has overcome the principle of conservation, you've now entered into a new location. And this is what I'm calling a liminal mind or liminal consciousness. And so the first thing to keep in mind is that this space, liminal consciousness, is in fact actually the base. This is the source from which paradigms emerge, and therefore it's also the place to which paradigms dissolve when they break up completely. And under the principle of conservation, when you find yourself in a circumstance where reality is quite distinct from the framework that you're using, the ability to modify your paradigm enough to be responsive to that level of distinctness might in fact just not be possible. Like that kind of change may not be available. And so it can often be the case that when confronted with circumstances that are substantially outside of the scope or capacity of the paradigm under which we're operating, the only valid response is to in fact drop into liminality. Now, liminality has itself certain characteristics. When you're in a truly deep liminal space, you don't necessarily even have the capacity to name the things that you're experiencing. So sense making can become very, very limited. And you might be in a park perceiving something that under a paradigmatic frame you would call a tree. But in a liminal space, you don't have a name for it. You're just experiencing it in its raw sensorium. And of course, this means you can be quite limited. Like your ability to make sense of and then make meaningful choices in your environment in a liminal space can be very limited. Beginner's mind and child's mind, children are quite liminal, and in many circumstances, this isn't the best place to be. And in fact, quite specifically, if you happen to be very successful, right, your paradigmatic framework has put you in a circumstance where you're a peak predator of the local niche. You know how to get shit done. You can change the world. You can control your environment. Then dropping out of that paradigm is a very challenging choice. And of course, this conundrum is one of the primary problematics. The people who are doing the best, the most successful elites, are in many ways the least capable, because it makes the least sense for them as individuals, of dropping out of their paradigm and dropping into liminality. And yet, as we said, when it is in fact the case that your paradigm is substantially maladaptive to the reality that you find yourself in, that is exactly what one needs to do. I think it's somewhat obvious why I bring up this particular concept today, because it is in fact my proposition that effectively all, or at least a substantial fraction of the enormously successful and effective paradigms that got us here, the 20th century frameworks, particularly 20th century Western frameworks, aren't adequate to the reality that we find ourselves in, the reality that largely their own success has given rise to. And this is particularly the case for experts, right? So if you're a very successful expert in government or academia or business, and you find yourself really thoughtfully, honestly paying attention to what's happening, and you notice that your toolkit isn't adequate to what's going on, you might find yourself, if you're healthy, dropping into a liminal space. And my recommendation, in fact, my counsel, is to allow that liminal space. In fact, to recognize how important it is to be good at dropping into and holding that liminal space, because that is the place from which truly innovative new concept and frameworks can emerge. It is the place where you have the highest degree of generative creativity. And it is precisely when one finds oneself in a circumstance that your legacy toolkit isn't adequate that you need to go there. And be mindful of the reality that it's going to feel awkward. It's going to feel vulnerable. It's going to feel weak. And you might even find yourself in circumstances where your social environment is pushing you and urging you to drop out of a liminal space and come back into the paradigmatic model where you're skillful, where you have command. And that, I think, is one of the biggest things that is facing people now, is the ability to be aware of the use and importance of liminal mind, and to be able to honestly and honorably drop out of no longer adaptive paradigms into the creative space of liminality, so that we can collaboratively generate a new toolkit that is adequate to the circumstances of the reality that we find ourselves in.